Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Christina Spalding, and this is an excerpt from the Unlocking Resiliency lecture called Why Are Some Animals More Resilient Than Others? One of the things that impacts resiliency is the qualities of the stressor itself. So, of course, more intense stressors are likely to cause more toxic stress. In other words, stress that the animal is not able to cope with. So a brief windstorm, strong windstorm that results in a tree down, that's obviously going to be far less stressful than being hit by a hurricane or a tornado. And of course, we can talk about any range of stressors that are going to vary in intensity. The other thing that matters is the frequency of the stressors. So if a stressor is only happening rarely, it will typically be easier for an animal to cope with that stressor than something that is happening over and over and over again. So in the dog training world, this is frequently something that's referred to as trigger stacking. And what's happening is the animal is not able to fully recover from the initial stressor before they are hit with another stressor. So the more frequent the stressors, the more difficult it's going to be for the animal to cope with them. Control is another big thing. We spend quite a bit of time in this course talking about control. I don't go into it a lot in this particular slide or this particular presentation, but we will spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of control and how much a difference that can make in the animal's ability to cope with stress. And then the last thing is predictability. How predictable is the stressor? And some researchers suggest that predictability is also actually linked to control, because if a stressor is predictable, then it's easier to escape that stressor because we can predict when it's going to happen and either entirely escape it or at least sort of prepare for it in one way or another so that we can cope better with it. Just think of situations in your own lives, right? It's much better if we know something's going to happen ahead of time, even if it's something that's negative, because we can prepare for it as opposed to something that happens suddenly and with no warning. So if we want to take a look at the big picture of what's going on in terms of how well an individual can cope with stress, or in other words, how resilient an individual is, I really like the model that was put together by Daskalakis and colleagues that they call the 3-hit concept of stress susceptibility. So the first thing you're looking at is genetics. The animal, every animal has a particular genetic code, genetic profile, and their experiences are going to be filtered through that genetic profile. So those genetic factors are going to interact with early life experience. So I'm talking about in utero, so before the animal is born, and then the juvenile stage and the adolescent stage. Those are the 3 big stages that are included in early life experience and early life development. And so all those experiences that they have during development are going to be influenced, the way that they respond to them and the way that those experiences impact that individual are going to be influenced by the genetics of that animal. And what happens is that those 2 factors, that gene by environment interaction, is going to cause physiological, functional, and anatomical changes to the brain, as well as other systems within the animal that will influence their ability to cope with stress later on in life. So again, what we're saying, what that means is that these early experiences that an animal has, so things that happen during puppyhood, things that happen during adolescence, or even while they're in mom's womb, will combine with genes to cause changes within that animal that will last throughout the life of the animal. What this tells us then is that we really need to pay a lot of attention to those developmental changes and really be focusing on prevention. We will also talk in this class about things that we can do once you have an animal that's already experienced early life stress, because obviously we don't have total control over that, or in many cases we have no control over that. But when possible, it's really important to try and focus on early interventions and prevention. And then again, we will talk later in the class about what we can do with animals that have already had those stressful experiences. Okay, so I just want to talk about one more thing before I wrap up this sample video. And this is another thing that researchers are speculating probably has an impact on an animal's resilience. And that is their sensitivity to rewards. We also talk about the sensitivity to punishment, but I'm just going to limit it to this slide for this sample video. So animals that are pessimistic tend to underestimate the likelihood of a reward. That also then will make them less motivated to work for a reward, right? So if your perception is that you're not that likely to get a reinforcer anyway, if the situation is uncertain or unclear whether or not a reinforcer is available, if an animal has a more pessimistic perspective, they're going to tend to assume that a reinforcer is not available, and that then is going to decrease their motivation to put in effort, right? Because why put in effort if you don't think it's going to pay off? Interestingly, though, with these animals, so let me just go back a second. We have research to support this concept that animals who are more pessimistic will not work as hard for a reward. However, if they do a behavior, if you can kind of convince them to do a behavior, or you start with a really low effort behavior, once they are reinforced, they still respond the same to that reinforcement. It's just getting the animal to put in the effort in the first place that can vary. And so researchers speculate that this may lead, this pessimism may lead to decreased positive affect, which just means decreased positive emotions or decreased positive mood, because they're not having as many opportunities to take advantage of positive things in their environment, right? And that decreased mood may ultimately also lead to decreased resilience. And the other thing that this brings up that I think is really interesting and super important when we're working with animals is this concept of the difference between wanting and liking. We know that there are different chemicals in the brain that influence wanting versus liking. So what do I mean by that? Liking indicates how pleasurable something is. So liking has to do with how much do you enjoy eating chocolate, for example. And that causes the release of endogenous opioids, which are just naturally occurring opioids in our body. And that means that the animal enjoys eating that thing. So if you give them a choice between, a carrot and chocolate, I'm using a human example here, of course, if you give many people a choice between a carrot and chocolate, many people are going to choose the chocolate over the carrot. However, how much you like something does not always correlate with how much you are willing to work with for something. And that is what wanting refers to. So wanting has to do with how much effort an animal will put in to get a particular reinforcer. And again, research has shown that if animals have a deficit in dopamine, for example, they may like something perfectly fine, but that does not mean that they are willing to work for it. And this, I think, is a really interesting point when we talk about food motivation, right? Because we will often say that, you know, if the animal eats food and they're not starving, that means they're food motivated. But the research actually suggests that what that actually means is that they like food and they will eat it if it's put in front of their face, but they won't necessarily work for it. And so this is a really important distinction that we can use to our advantage when we're working with animals. If it seems that they like a food, but they're not working for it, then we need to really be looking at motivation as opposed to trying to find a better and better reinforcer. I'm not saying that finding a better reinforcer will never work, but it's not always going to be enough on its own. So thank you for joining me for this video. If you guys are interested in learning more about these topics and more about stress and resilience in general, you can take a look at my Unlocking Resilience course that is on my platform at www.sciencemattersllc.com. Thank you.